The first thing to kind of allow yourself to accept as something that is real is the phrase that I've used is history happens. It's very odd to me, actually, that people who are perfectly capable of knowing that, for example, the Roman Empire rose and fell, it actually happened, there's no question, that occurred in reality, somehow are incapable of perceiving the notion that therefore it might happen again. So let's just accept the notion that that kind of thing happens on occasion. All right. Be open to the possibility. Okay, next. Okay, well, how? How do those kinds of things show up? Well, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, we can if you'd like, but there's certain characteristics that we can actually begin to take a look at that give us a sense of where things are. And, well, where we are is actually rather challenging. Now, we're in a situation which is definitely not awesome and probably is quite bad. Okay, well, how bad? How big an order of magnitude trouble are we looking at? Well, let's just take a couple of examples to kind of gauge the order of magnitude. Let's just start with one. Everybody's involved, the whole world. Every single human being on the planet is involved in this story. That has never happened before. Before, right now, anytime any trouble has emerged, it's been a tiny, tiny fraction of the human family. The biggest collapse of all time, the Bronze Age collapse, happened right there, and it hit, 15%. Most of the cities, but 15% of the people. Now everybody's involved. So if anything goes sideways that is vaguely of the order of magnitude of something of that kind, it's going to be a lot bigger. Like a lot bigger. Because these things reinforce each other. You may notice that when things go south, people become less good at dealing with each other gently, which makes it worse. Let's try another one. We have nukes. Lots of us have nukes, and we're getting better at making nukes, so more of us are going to have nukes. And we don't just have nukes, we also have CRISPR, which means that people can start making genetic weapons that are nuke-like in capacity. And over time, not too long from now, we're also going to have micro drones that can target, assassinate pretty much anybody unconsciously. Fill in the blank, which is to say that up until now, no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't really kill that many of us. We tried really hard. We had guns and bullets and gas, and we still didn't kill that many of us. If you take a look at the human population, even the Black Plague is like a little divot. Now, we can in fact kill everybody, or at least mostly everybody. Okay, next. Technological change. I don't know if you've seen the charts that show the pace of technological change, but if you look at a graph that goes like this, and you're here, things are different than they were when you were here. And the 1940s was like here in terms of the pace of change that was going on. The degree to which our actuation capacity, our capacity to do things in the world is accelerating is really not comprehensible to anyone. I wrote an essay called The Generation Omega where I talked about if the amount of change is continuing to move at the current pace, then the capacity of the people who are in the current generation, I think it's like 30 years from now, will be 1 million times more than now. And to kind of get a sense of that, that's like going from inventing language to the computer in a single generation. Right? And of course, we already have computers, so what's that look like? That's big. Right? Let me think. There's like 3 or 4 more. Oh, sorry, climate. We've got the whole world. Every single one of our activities has a characteristic that it generates an externality that is not well processed by the complex environment. When we're relatively lightweight, there's not many of us and we're not engaging in a lot of those activities, the complex environment can still process it. Sometimes. Heavy metals, not so much. Well, there's a lot of us, and we have increasingly intensive activities. So I'm not really talking about climate change, which is kind of scary, but it's like this big on the scale. I'm talking about comprehensive disruption of the entire complex web of the ecosystem across every single bind. I'm talking about concentration of heavy metals, hormones. I'm talking about the complete depletion of oxygen in oceans. I mean, it's a shit show, and it's n-dimensional. It's all over the place, and each one reinforces the others. So at some point, all we need is a little tipping point here or there, and you get cascade effects that run all over the place. I can go on, by the way. There's about 500 of these, each one of which tells the same story. It's big. The order of magnitude is at least 1,000 years, and probably on the order of 1 million years. We're talking about the origin of humanity big. And maybe even bigger than that. So now the question is, how in God's name do we deal with that? Well, we probably haven't the slightest idea. And we're as human beings, we're we live 100 years, and most of that is like in a 30-year window, like where we're actually agentically acting out in the world. So we're not really wired to deal with things that are magnitudes larger than that. We aren't well designed to perceive things that are much bigger than us or much smaller than us in scale, space, or time. So then we have to ask ourselves, what might be? What kind of thing might we be part of or be in relationship with that is the kind of thing that deals in orders of magnitude that are even vaguely in the size that we're dealing with? And so the proposition is that perhaps it's something like culture. Maybe even something deeper than culture, like the generator function that gives rise to culture itself, like innovation in evolution, right? Something of that order. So when I say culture, what I mean is we create artifacts, institutions, stories, technologies that actuate our capacity, increase our capacity to think and to do in the world, and that change us. Right? So we create them, they create us, and together we co-evolve. Right? But they're artifacts that are produced by us through our intelligence, through our hands, and our capacity to do things in the world. Of this, one of the things that we do is we tell stories. And when we tell stories, we will often find that our stories are built around these mythopoetic archetypes. Now, there's two possible ways of grasping this notion of mythopoetic archetype. Well, three. One is to say that it's nonsense, but I'm going to ignore that one. The second, and is the most common, is to say, well, it's an artifact of culture, that cultures have been telling stories for a long time. And to the degree to which certain stories have been showing up over and over again, which means that they're in cultures that have been around, or they keep showing up in cultures, one of the two, they have a density to them. They have a perennialness to them. And so they're the kind of thing that you might want to consider counting on when things get squishy. So that's one way of taking a look at it. So if we're dealing with something that's in the order of magnitude of, say, 1,000 years, that by itself is enough. If we're going to be trying to search for what are the kinds of things that pass on through 1,000-year cycles, we're going to have to be looking for the deep mythopoetic locations in our stories, and by the way, in our bodies. So let's talk about our bodies, because the same thread works at a longer scale. Our bodies are narratives, in a sense, meaning that the kinds of things that have been showing up for now thousands of generations, the things that have been showing up that made us Homo sapiens sapiens, instincts that are wired into us at a very deep level, at a pre-cognitive level, are still mythopoetic in the deeper sense, meaning that they are the kinds of things that showed up because they continue to show up. Protect your young is a mythopoetic that is in the body. It is physical. Because obviously, any being that has young that are not fish, right? Any being that has a small number of young that are relatively vulnerable and doesn't embody protect your young is quickly extinguished. Now, of course, we can be conscious of that and have it as a virtue, but our body naturally expresses it. And so that process is even deeper. So we can say, okay, well, what is that? What's happening there? Is there a story in that? Are there deep threads that are actually showing up that brings us to where we are? Now I can say, well, the mythopoetic stories are both. They're both narratives that have happened to keep showing up, and they are also wisdom that has been endeavoring to find the deepest threads that have been showing up in our bodies that are as deep as we can go, and to reify them into things that can be made available to consciousness so that we can refine them and do them well. That is the ground upon which you can build something that might endure.